Hi everybody. Great to be on the call with you. So my name's Kieron. I'm Chief Executive of a charitable foundation in the UK called Guys and St Thomas' Charity, and I'll come on to that in a bit about what we do. But my background prior to this role was working in the public service. So I worked in the UK government, where most recently I headed up the UK government's work around broadly social innovation, but specifically social investment. So we created an organisation called Big Society Capital, did a lot of work around things like social impact bonds and blended funds. And previous to that, I worked across the British government in the Foreign Office and the Prime Minister's office. And I started out my career as, for my sins, as a strategy consultant. Hey, I thought as kind of a start to all of this, just to flag, I think we all in our careers occasionally feel like frauds. I have the added benefit of knowing that I'm a fraud. So I'm by no means an expert on complexity or how you affect systems level change on complex issues. But it is an issue that I've worked in and around on various points of my career, and especially now in the sort of work that we're doing here at the Charitable Foundation. So I thought I would share with you just some points about stuff that we're finding. I'm going to kind of talk through a presentation that kind of gives it some context, and hopefully those will be useful inputs to a broader discussion that we can have around these sorts of issues. So I'm going to try and share a presentation via the Zoom platform. I'm not very good at this sort of thing, but has that come up on people's screens?
Looks good here.
Yeah, fantastic, great. Well, I'm just gonna kind of work through this presentation with you. So, just to give some context in particular to where a lot of this is drawn from is the experience we have at Guys and St Thomas' Charity. Just to say a little bit about us, we're one of those peculiarly European charitable foundations in that we're about 500 years old. And what we are is one of Europe's largest place-based charitable foundations. So we work specifically in South London in the UK. And I'll come on to a bit about kind of why we focus on complexity and what we've learnt from that, and therefore kind of perhaps some ideas about how you might affect systems level change on complex issues, but all shared in kind of in the spirit of this is what we're finding, this is some of the stuff that we think is relevant to our work, and would love to know if it's relevant to yours and your views on these sorts of issues as well. My sense is on some of this sort of territory that nobody has the answer, and what we're all doing is just kind of working through it together to identify how it might influence our work. So if I've kind of just tracked along slides, does this mean that people are on the same slide as me, which explains a little bit about our work, saying that we work to tackle the major challenges affecting people in urban, diverse and deprived areas? Do people see that slide?
Yes, unless they're calling in by phone.
Okay, if you're calling in on phone, I'll do my very best to describe kind of the sort of slide that we have in front of us. So yeah, just a little bit about our work. So as I say, we're a place-based foundation, and I'll talk about our work here and then how that kind of abstracts to some ideas around complexity. So essentially what we do is we focus on, wonderful. Angela, you can see it even on the phone. Superb. So we focus in on health challenges. We're a health charity, and we focus on health challenges affecting people predominantly in inner city areas. And when we focus in on some of the biggest challenges, what we're finding is that these challenges are super complex, really complex issues to deal with. And so this has kind of led us to think about, well, what is it? What does it mean to say that something is complex? And what is the difference between complex and complicated? So a lot of issues I think that we deal with in public benefit or public service are complicated. And so you might kind of use the definition here of building a rocket. Building a rocket and sending it to the moon is complicated, like super, super complicated. But there's a process that you can follow. And if you follow that process carefully, could reliably get the same sorts of outcomes, i.e. you could reliably build a similar rocket again and again and again, and most frequently get to the moon and occasionally back as well. So it's not easy, that's complicated. What we find is that a lot of the issues we're dealing with go beyond being complicated, however. They go into being complex. And then when you kind of start thinking about, well, what do we mean by complexity? You start seeing these sorts of kind of diagrams being drawn. This is kind of the fairly famous one of trying to map the conditions, the status of Afghanistan, and essentially trying to work out essentially how does everything tie in together. And it looks bonkers, doesn't it? It looks so incredibly complex that it goes well beyond complicated. So I guess one of the things to call out is, what does it mean to say that something is complex rather than complicated? And there seem to be kind of three factors that certainly in everything, in all of our work, that we've noted and others have pointed us to. And so these three factors essentially being that complex systems are emergent, that feedback plays a really important role, and that they adapt. So just to kind of go through those very kind of quickly in turn, what does that mean? So I guess kind of to say that something is emergent or a system is emergent, basically to us kind of suggests that you just can't, it's something that you can't predict based just on the sum of its parts. So if you take something like crime, for example, crime is an emergent property of things like employment, economic growth, transport, social connectedness, and really, really tricky to say any given system, how will crime play out? It's emergent, you can't just predict it from the inputs. To say that kind of feedback's really important in complex systems is essentially to say that kind of like these complex systems are constantly changing, and that change can reinforce or balance further change. So for example, if you were to take something like a drinking ban in public, so you could have an alcohol ban in public places. If you have that ban, it reduces the visibility and convenience of drinking in public places, probably makes it less appealing. So fewer young people might then start drinking, and so it's less visible, so less attractive. So all of a sudden, actually, there's kind of a virtuous cycle that's emerged there, a feedback loop within a complex system. And then finally, to say that it's adaptive is just to say that, you know, if you kind of push on one end of the system, something else might happen elsewhere. So for example, again, to take a sort of kind of a health angle, if you had a government that had a public smoking ban, then you might see cigarette companies start to reduce the price of cigarettes to encourage more people to buy them. So that feels to those three things about emergence, feedback, and adaptation feel important ways of determining kind of that something is a complex system rather than a complicated one. And that matters to us in our sort of work. So the sorts of things that we focus on, we take a long-term perspective on just a small number of issues. So things like, how do you improve the lives of people with multiple long-term conditions? So where we work in London, for example, of every 5 people who have diabetes, just one of them only has diabetes. It's more normal to have lots of things going wrong with you. Or, for example, tackling things like childhood obesity, where, again, where we work in London, we have some of Europe's highest rates of childhood obesity. These feel to us complex issues. It's not to say that every issue is complex, but they're more than complicated. So just in kind of a few minutes, I just thought I'd kind of share some ideas of what we're finding about how we think you might be able to go about kind of affecting change on complex issues, drawn from our work on health, but hopefully you'll be able to kind of draw from this lessons that are totally applicable to other policy areas. So let's take something like childhood obesity. In front of us, this is a map drawn in the UK a few years back around trying to map out what drives obesity. And you probably can't read all of it, but it's incredibly, it looks like a big bowl of spaghetti. And it's so difficult to know, well, if you're trying to affect change within this, what on earth do you do? Where do you start? How do you know how to prioritize? How do you not kind of feel scared basically into inaction, really knowing how to begin. So some of the things we think can help you start to kind of cut through some of that complexity to start affecting change. Well, the first one of them that we think is quite important is to think quite hard about place, to think about kind of the domain in which you're trying to affect change, where that might be occurring. I put a map up here just kind of to give some context to this of how we think about this in our work. So for example, we focus on childhood obesity. What we've done is we've begun to think about, well, actually, where do we want to be active in tackling childhood obesity? And what we noticed here is that there's a real overlap between areas with high levels of cultural and ethnic diversity on exactly the same map, the areas with low household income, and then on that, areas with really high levels of childhood obesity. So we're focusing our work within kind of the areas of highest childhood obesity. But really what we're doing there, I think, is we're defining that there's an actual place we want to work, like a kind of geographic area we want to work, but there's a type of place we're looking to work, so one that's urban, diverse and deprived. But also what we think focusing on place does is it allows you to then start to think about the context of people who live within that place. So what is their lived experience of some of these complex challenges? Which is quite a useful way for getting into think about how do you engage communities, or how do you become more user-centered work. So that's thing number one, thinking about place. Thing number two is, I guess, kind of thinking about, well, kind of what breadth of partnerships do you need to affect systems level change? So again, kind of focusing on health, it gets quite interesting to think how far you have to go back when you're trying to affect change in a complex system. So take health, for example. Increasingly, the evidence suggests that although quite a lot of health is to do access to healthcare, a great deal of our health and well-being is to do with much wider things. It's to do with more social and commercial determinants of health. So things like the job you have, your social connectedness, the housing you live in. Essentially, what's interesting, I think, about this is to think about when affecting systems level change on complex systems is essentially like, how wide do you have to go? How broad do your partnerships have to be? And some people speak about the distinction between parameters and variables. So, parameters might feel something about a system that you just can't change. So, for example, to say our work in South London, we know that housing is important for health. But there's not much we're not a big enough organisation to build lots and lots of housing for people. So that feels like a parameter to us. So it feels like housing is something that is fixed and is a given. And so we need to in our work, think about how we work around that. But quite a lot of people say, well, how about you try and move your work such that housing doesn't stay as a parameter, so something fixed and given, but becomes a variable, i.e. something that you can influence. So for example, should we in our work in trying to affect change in a complex system, should we be working with housing builders or housing associations? I.e., if you draw the right partnerships in your complex work or your work in complex systems, do you shift something from being a fixed parameter to a variable that you can then affect change on? I think the third thing, so if we've had place and we've had what is the right breadth of partnerships, is thinking about what's your unique value. Now, I've put a fairly technical slide in front of us, but I've really interesting one shared with us by Harry Rutter of the London School of Tropical and Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and himself drawing on some work from Swinburne and others. Essentially, what this is looking at is how do you affect change on something really complex like public health issues, and saying that some of the really big impact stuff to do is very, very difficult to do. So like the systemic drivers, so take, say, something like childhood obesity, one really easy way that you could control childhood obesity is you could put huge taxes on all manner of unhealthy food. But that's difficult to do politically. It's unclear whether there's any general popular will or public mandate for that. So that's very, very difficult to do. So that's on one side of this. On the other side, there's a lot of evidence around treatment approaches to childhood obesity. They might just not be as effective. And I guess the point from this being is that if you're going to be intervening in complex systems, knowing where your unique value So for example, for us as an organisation, we don't control a lot of systemic drivers. We're not part of, we don't have legislative tools at our disposal, which many of you will have. But we're very well located on the ground. So there are certain things that we can do, which is much more difficult to do from a position as a kind of, for example, a central government. So kind of knowing your unique value can be quite important for thinking about how do you act. And I guess kind of the final thing I'd pull out is all of our work suggests that you probably need to pull on many levers at once. So a good picture to kind of draw here is that of sandbags. If you're trying to stop a flood, one sandbag tends not to do the job, but many do. And what's quite interesting is it probably doesn't matter incredibly the order within which you place those sandbags. It's rather the accumulation of them adds up to more than the sum of their parts. So again, this kind of ties back into kind of knowing your unique value, which bit of the sandbag are you, the breadth of partnerships, where you're going to find those other sandbags, and kind of place is kind of how you're going to focus in on a specific enough remit to be able to put those sandbags in the right place. Share with you, not to go through in any detail, but essentially give a really practical example of what this can mean or what this can look like. For example, in our childhood obesity work, we've tried to map out what sorts of areas where we think we need to be active, in neighbourhoods, broader than that and nationally, the sorts of environments, be they the home, the street, or the school where kids pass through. And then we've just started to think about, well, what are the different sort of interventions that we can be backing within those? And we need to kind of then think about, well, how do those interact with each other? And then how do those interact with broader public shifts, broader political shifts and the like? But hopefully you see from that, at least kind of one route where you can go from a very, very complex looking obesity foresight map to a way of saying, well, we kind of understand some of what we're going to get on with first, and then we can measure as we go and see what seems to be having an impact. So that's kind of really whistle-stop tour through some kind of ideas around complexity, and I've tried to kind of place them in some context, given some work that we're doing at the moment on tackling a complex issue. There are some questions left for me, but there's questions that I was kind of quite keen to, for us to maybe kind of, Sean, if it works for you, to push on with. So one of them is, I'd just be really interested in how this relates to other people's on the call's experience. We're all in our own ways kind of working at these sorts of issues, and how have you kind of found that distinction between complicated and complex, and then kind of navigating a path through complexity, which really is also kind of the second question there, which is what balance is needed between clarity and complexity. And this is one I think that we really, we're thinking very hard about. Too much complexity stalls you. Clarity, though, if it's oversimplification, will draw you probably into thinking that you're solving an issue when actually you're only dealing with one part of it, and you'll be surprised down the line that you haven't had as much impact as you thought. So how do you get the right balance between clarity and complexity? And I think particularly important, the last question, like what does this mean for how we work with others, is really interesting, particularly for those who work in the public service. So I guess if you're on a apolitical platform, then you're interested in innovation in public service. And I guess one of the things that we see as we kind of look at these complex systems, be it around sort of work we do or the work that I've done in the past, is just how government does not have all the levers to answer these sorts of problems, but it does have specific levers. So kind of knowing the unique value that government has, the unique levers it has, but also the constraints and limitations, and therefore who else needs to be partners, who else needs to be in the gang to try and solve things. So those are kind of three questions that I thought we might kind of pick up on as we explore some of these questions around affecting systems level change on complex issues, and perhaps we can kind of draw in some of the other questions, Sean, that were shared with us.
Great, thank you. And Angela, I know you might have a thought or a question here. If you'd like to start us off. Make sure to unmute yourself. Uh, there
Hi
you are.
there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so my question is, how can one influence decision makers to respect evidence-based data to inform decisions or decision making?
It's really, really
Like
interesting.
that's
Yeah, do you want to unpack that a bit, Angela? I mean,
so one of the challenges in working in the public service, I'm not sure about, I can't speak for everyone else, but I can certainly speak for where I am currently,
yeah,
is that sometimes, data is presented and decision makers really, I don't know if it's how it's presented or like I've tried to unpack it and make it as clear as possible, eliminating most of the complexity and just trying to like use simple language to outline some of the challenges faced, for example, in an operational environment. And so my question is, how can one influence this process further for decision makers to respect that data to inform decision making? Because sometimes the opposite actions are taken.
and why do you think that might be? So, do you think it's a question of understanding? Do you think it's a question
I
of
definitely do understand. Like there's like lots of complexities at the top, including
yeah,
political appetite, budget, whether you're able to actually like have the capacity, for example, to hire more staff, or if you
yeah,
want to do a further process improvement review before all those pieces are undertaken? I definitely understand that, but at the same point in time, and certainly from like my policy standpoint and background, where rational data and evidence is presented, and it's clearly backed up by the evidence and your
yeah,
recommendations are made, those should at least be considered.
yeah,
So my question is really, how do you influence that process
yeah, yeah?
for consideration?
Well, I'll certainly be very interested in other people's perspectives on that. Certainly, my own experience has always been about kind of the hearts and minds of this piece.
Aha.
That data itself, even kind of rational, kind of very, very empirical, well-backed data, there is kind of there's a heart's bit to this. Some of which is actually just how all of us make decisions that we think that we're being rational in them, but actually we bring a whole load of kind of preconceptions or frames to them. I also wouldn't be when kind of thinking about this based on my own experience, is thinking about kind of what's good enough. So, for example, when I worked in kind of the Prime Minister's office, often you would be trying to get really kind of clear evidence data in front of people who were very, very busy and often kind of took decisions on the basis of their kind of political judgments. Indeed, that's what had made them successful in his careers to date. And so sometimes it felt to me the art was about, well, I don't think I'm going to be able to get everything I need to in front of them. I don't think I'm going to be able to create the most compelling, to get them to really get into the data. So what do I think are kind of absolutely critical things that the data, so I don't have to land everything, but it's very, very important that I land these one or two things. And then very, very, very finally, as a thought, and I don't know if this was just kind of the British civil service, and we're kind of all we're too polite to say certain things. But often, actually, I think some people didn't always understand the data, but were reticent to own up to not understanding the data. So sometimes lends itself to, rather than kind of using the data to try and say, you should read this into this, asking people a more open question of, with this data that we're looking at, what do you see within it? It helps lead people to kind of their own discovery, but also I think for you as kind of the policymaker, it can expose, well, actually, what do I know that this person doesn't? Do I have a greater facility with this type of knowledge versus the person I'm trying to influence? So those were some of the things that I kind of found from my experience, but I'm sure others on the call have also kind of found kind of tips and tricks about what works. I mean, Sean, have you?
Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Maria, I don't know if you have a similar experience in Canada, or David, if you'd like to share your perspective, or Glynis.
Hi, Sean. This is Maria calling in. I totally hear what was just said. I guess from more of a public administration theory, there is a bit of that balance between evidence base and values, and politicians do enjoy that privilege of deciding what are the priorities based on the political values of the governing party. And for us, it's always about, you never stop with developing evidence-based policy advice, because one day there is that sort of policy window where that opportunity will present itself, and you don't want that window to open, and you haven't really developed that really fulsome advice when it is ready to be heard.
Thank you.
I think just I think that's brilliant. It was once described to me that kind of almost the act of making change happen is to kind of to have your list ready of things ready to go with, and just you're waiting for the right window to try and kind of jump through when it arises. I think there is, to bring us back to complexity, I think there is something quite interesting about different types of data as well. So certainly I know that it's quite easy to sometimes as the person working in public service to bring data that's very, very quantitative, can be quite it can be developed over many years, and is often kind of quite top down. It might be something that we regularly survey people on. And of course, that's incredibly powerful types of data. I think when kind of getting into kind of complexity, however, there's different types of data that can be really, really valuable. And so, for example, some of the other kind of apolitical sessions have been on things like user design. And I think that's also interesting data where ethnography, lived experience can point to patterns that the data might not yet show, but people kind of feel in their lived experience. And now, I think part of the challenge is how do you expose that, and how do you make that feel as rigorous to you as perhaps some of the more quantitative data. But certainly when trying to influence political decision makers, particularly those that are kind of bringing a values or a political orientation to things, that can feel just as valid data. And in my mind, it probably on complex issues probably is often just as valid data as well, i.e. you need to think about the quantitative and the qualitative alongside one another.
I think that's a really valuable point. Within the Government of Canada, we are looking at user-centered experience and design thinking, and getting to, because I know for more quantitative data, you need like statistically significant sample sizes for the data to be valid. But a lot of the times, some of our programming, we're working with very limited budgets, so we don't draw enough numbers and clientele, but we're looking at trying to complement that with user experience surveys, certainly interviews, and that's a certain, like it's a smaller amount of people that can feed into that.
Really interesting. And I guess one thing that allows for, sometimes there's potentially a bit more agility in the way that policy is implemented as well. I don't think anybody now really believes that kind of the only model to work is to come up with something on a whiteboard somewhere, implement it at scale, measure it 5 years after it was put to work, and then take a call on whether it was successful or not. i.e. what are the kind of the points of iteration and refocus that you can bring during the implementation. And I think some of that user work that you were describing there, Maria, is a really effective way into it.
I wanted to ask a question from someone who works in South Australia but couldn't be on the call because it's the middle of the night.
Mm.
She works in the area of child protection, specifically early intervention and prevention, a wicked issue that requires a multi-pronged approach from across sectors. How do you move forward to create change when there is goodwill but a hesitation to be bold?
What a brilliant question, and I think kind of this broader perhaps so I don't have a snappy answer to that, but certainly kind of some of the things that we've been thinking about in our work are have kind of similar sorts of similar patterns to them, i.e. you need kind of multi-sectoral activity. You need change to occur incrementally over time in lots and lots of different people. Everybody's kind of up for it, but it's all quite scary. It's not exactly known in systems that are emergent, that are adaptive, and where the kind of feedback can have unintended consequences, exactly how you move forward. So some of the things that we think about, and perhaps this is easier for those of us who have a kind of a regional or sub-regional focus rather than a national one, is to base quite a lot of this in community, or use community as the route to change. So I'll give a very practical example from the UK of how over the past 10 years there's been a real shift in how we think about mental health. Go back 10 years, mental health wasn't really spoken about by many people. I think it was a real kind of stigmatized subject. People were very quiet about it. And I think we've seen in the UK over the past 10 years is a gradual shift towards people being much more open, kind of focusing on mental health alongside physical health, but thinking about mental health is probably something that you should focus on, and it's something that's okay to speak about, and the like. And when you speak to the people who've been involved in that shift over the past 10 years, it's very interesting them explaining how they thought about how did you kind of shift kind of a multi-sectoral approach over time. And the way that a lot of them spoke about it was that the route to it is to spend time with people who had mental health issues, and to ask them two very simple questions. So one was, what do you want for yourself? What do you want out of life? What do you want as a person with mental health issues? What do you want for yourself? And what do you want from your community? What do you want from those around you? Be it your neighbours, be it your employer, be it those who provide services to you. And essentially within that being able to draw a sort of kind of a Venn diagram of what people wanted for themselves, about what people wanted from their communities, and then asking their broader communities, well, how do you think about mental health? What do you think are important issues around this? And then kind of the intersection of those three circles started to identify kind of critical things which met a need, but also were where people were. It wasn't asking communities or service providers or employers to be much more advanced in their thinking on this than it was. And then use that as their point of influence. So from there, they ran things like social marketing campaigns and kind of public messaging and got political messaging behind these sorts of ideas. And I guess kind of two things that happened within that. So one is that they had worked out a way in an issue of kind of real complexity, where there was some kind of, exactly as the question said, like there was hesitation to be bold, but actually, where are we most likely to be impactful? What is something that's important to do, but isn't too far away from where people are? But I think probably even more importantly than that, the act of asking people this question had to some extent started to build communities who were focusing on mental health or the question of mental health. Such that when this marketing happened, it fell upon much more fertile territory. People were able to run with it and build from it. So I don't know if that's it's quite a long-winded answer, but I think there is something that when you do have these sorts of wicked issues that require a lot of people being involved, perhaps kind of the point of clarity is to really engage with the person whose world you're hoping will get better as a result of this change, and build out from there, rather than doing it from the outside in.
Wow. Does anyone else have a similar experience or thought on that question, or Kieron's comment?
This is Maria again from the Government of Canada. I would just say I was talking to, so I work in the public service side, and yesterday there was an event, and I work at the federal level, and I happened to speak with a city politician, and it was a very interesting exchange to see it on the other side, because what he had said was the public service at the city level are very hesitant. They don't like being told what to do. And so they just made this shift in terms of, and it was on climate change, that wicked problem. And they are trying to push staff to come up with climate mitigation strategies. But then they shifted their strategy into what Kieron was calling this line of questioning in terms of how might we do this? How might we create corporate commitments to reduce our environmental footprint? And that's when the public service really started to move, started to develop really interesting ideas. So I guess that's my one thought onto it. The other part, in terms of the public service side, and it goes back to the presentation between the relationship of complexity and complicated. I think complicated, we work in a web of rules inside the machinery of government, but we're trying to tackle really wicked problems. And so sometimes the systems that we work in aren't fast enough to be able to respond. So those are my two initial thoughts and reflections.
Really interesting. And well, I'd be fascinated by other people's kind of thoughts, particularly. I mean, I love the kind of the how might we questions, but particularly on that latter point, it feels such an important one of the way that we're going about making decisions. To what extent does that help or hinder us, particularly if they're based on patterns that were drawn many years previously? So, for example, quite a lot of my experience in the British government was that we had to do quite a lot of work to think about, well, a lot of the structures we have, a lot of the ways that we make decisions were basically designed, 80 years ago, some of them, when the world was a very, very different place, and certainly probably had change might have happened less fast. Certainly the world was probably slightly less volatile. Certainly it was kind of pre-digital everything. So I'll be interested kind of in other people's perspectives on that. So for those of you who are trying to affect systems level change on complex issues, how much do you feel that like part of the question has to be looking at how you yourself and the organizations you're based in make decisions?
Hi, I think that's a really critical question. It's Angela here. And I really think, understanding the actual organizational dynamic within which decisions are made is absolutely essential to understanding how to further go up the chain and be able to really influence to a great degree. And I also think relationships and the collaborative nature of relationships that, exist in government are also one of the kind of foundational pieces, and building those relationships as you climb, nurturing them as well. So I think from my experience, they're kind of hand in hand.
Yeah.
to be able to have that kind of level of ability to make changes that could really benefit the population as a whole.
Really interesting, and I certainly kind of my experience. I don't know if this is others. Is in kind of really practical ways. So, for example, where I worked in government, we were had to wear a security pass behind kind of umpteen different gates to get to where we got to, and I always wondered about how easy it was to engage with people when even kind of the geography of where you sat often made it tricky to meet people. I think so. For example, some of kind of the innovations you see are where people kind of deliberately break down kind of physical barriers. You co-locate people. You create co-working spaces where different types of thinker or people with different types of levers within the public service can work together to precisely get to this point that you were saying, Angela, about, well, how do you build the relationships with the kind of sufficient breadth of who you're building the relationships with?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Well, it was just to say that I totally agree with you about kind of the importance of building relationships, but often it's stuff that feels relatively prosaic that can get in the way of that. So, for example, how a lot of governments are organised is you get all the people who work on one policy area and you put them in one building. You get all the people who work on another policy area and you put them in the building across the road or across the city or across the country. Is that a great model for systems level change on complex issues?
I definitely don't think so. That's just a model for working in silos.
Yeah.
And kind of recreating or regenerating the same kind of thinking around particular issues or complex issues or managing them. I think the key is that cross-horizontal collaborative work that often, if you're fortunate enough to be in, I call it the right circles with the right deputy minister, assistant deputy minister, then, who believe in that kind of collaborative effort across, ministries, across boundaries, across, geography, then the magic happens. That's how I see it. I mean, that's based on my experience. And I've also experienced the opposite, where it's just an awful situation where there's not enough collaboration and not enough input. And it's kind of regurgitating the exact same, responses and being in a reactionary kind of mode to the same issues.
One thing I've discovered since stepping out of the public service, still working on public benefit, but now I've kind of run a charitable foundation, is actually how often exactly the same question comes up amongst the world of charitable foundations as well, about how effectively they're working together on these sorts of issues. So I don't think they're limited just to kind of working in public service, being a civil servant, working in government. I think quite a lot of these do relate to the fact that often kind of public benefit questions are really complex, and there are lots of different ways in which you could organise yourselves, teams to work around them. So less about kind of it being about any particular any organisational route to it. Everything's going to carry its dislocations. Rather, how do you get the right spirit of working? How do you get the right sense of collaboration, of openness, of inquiry, of how might we questions? Is probably critical. Though often, the first thing is to kind of try and draw on a whiteboard again, like different organisational setups that somehow solve those problems.
I wonder if I could come in. It's Samantha Willen here. I did join late. I'm sorry about that. But what I've picked up has been really interesting. I'm based in South Africa. And I guess for me, one of the big questions around policymakers and influencing the agenda and even getting to them, I mean, I like the conversation around the geography of exclusion and inclusion as well. But something that we tackle a lot is how do we get the policymakers, how do we get people to see and take seriously the amazing small interventions that are out there? We have so much, whether it's climate change or violence against women, or economic empowerment, we always have the 2 or 3 go-to interventions that everybody's talking about. But we know that there are so many amazing things happening that are small, and they deserve attention too. How do you get that onto the policymakers' agenda? Whereas so many policymakers are trying to stamp the big ones that are out there already.
Yeah. I've certainly got I think it's a brilliant question. I've certainly got my views on it. But I wonder if others have before I dive in.
This is the Government of Canada again, Maria here. That is actually, as I was referring to an earlier story, I spoke with a city politician yesterday, and it was on climate mitigation. And actually, so I work in Ottawa, which is the capital city of Canada, and a more famous city is Vancouver, and they're actually way, way, way ahead in terms of climate mitigation. And what he had said was, because budgets are tight, it's, let them be the leader. We'll learn from them, and whatever works, we will then invest our money into adapting what works. So I think those small scale examples are very important to highlight, because right now in a time of fiscal restraint, I'm not sure what it's like for all the other governments out there. Politicians are excited about, okay, what works before they invest, so that, that's something that works can scale.
Yeah, how interesting. I mean, certainly kind of from my side, I find the question of scale really interesting, having worked at national government and then kind of much more locally. I sometimes think it's important to kind of, because Samantha, I share your pain on this particular one, of thinking about, well, when we're talking about scale, what exactly are we talking about? So are we talking about scaling an intervention, an actual intervention, like a specific set of things, like almost like a product? Are we talking about scaling an idea, like a broad idea that sat behind the intervention, so kind of a general theme? Or are we talking about scaling a process by which the idea was arrived at, or the intervention? And I think often people are imprecise around this, about what they actually mean by scale. I think my own view is that too often we focus on scaling the intervention, when really probably what we should be focusing on at the very least is scaling the process, because the process might be simpler. That might be the one thing that is consistent. You go through a similar process, but what that actually looks like can be very, very different in different places. And own view is that context really does matter. And certainly, I know that my own kind of experience in public benefit as a policymaker had its fair share of failures, where there wasn't kind of sufficient attention to context. And so I'll give like one really practical example, because it's always helpful to share failures. A lot of people in the UK, particularly those of kind of lower income households, don't have bank accounts. And it means that certain goods and services are much more expensive to them, because it's much more expensive to kind of them if you can't set up a regular payment from your bank account. So one policy initiative, which seemed really, really sensible, was set up people with access to bank accounts and do this so that they can then have cheaper energy, because particularly what this was focusing on was that it costs more to buy your electricity if you buy it as and when you need it, rather than kind of setting up like a regular payment, or we call it direct debit in the UK. So it seems like it's a brilliant answer. Get everybody banked. It will kind of reduce the cost of energy to them, that everybody should be up for this. How often was rolled out, what we discovered was that actually it was not very successful. Not many people wanted to take advantage of it. And one of the things that was going on behind it, it turned out to be, the whole thing turned out to be very unsuccessful, was that for a number of people, actually, what they were using to buy their electricity was a prepaid meter, like one that I put money into, a fixed amount, and then when the money runs out, your electricity runs out. And to policymakers, that had looked like it was a really expensive way of buying electricity, but to some people, that was actually a very effective way of budgeting. If they were on really tight income, they knew how much money that they wanted to put to food or had to put to food, how much to put to buy electricity, how much to their kids' clothes, etc. And so actually kind of resolving the access to a bank account didn't really meet the need. And I sometimes tell that story a lot, and I used to tell that story quite a lot within government as well, of saying this is why context matters. And then we know that context does vary from place to place. And that's why the power of small can be really helpful. But perhaps rather than kind of have where you get the scale benefits, might be thinking about, well, what are good processes that you can go through to arrive at what might be the relevant answer for that place at that time. But I think it's such an important question, Samantha, that the public service really needs to grapple with, particularly on these sorts of complex issues.
I think you're so right, and that example is so powerful, isn't it? Where with all the best intentions in the world, you just forgot to consult the people. Yeah. No, I completely agree about the context, because so I work for a program called What Works to Prevent Violence Against Women and Girls. And we're looking at interventions, and we're looking at adapting interventions from South Africa, Tajikistan, Nepal, all over. And that process and context is exactly what we're finding along the way. In fact, the process of working in those very different settings, where we went in with an intervention which had an RCT and was very effective, but we had no idea if it was going to work there, whether it would be received. And then it had to be adapted to the relevance of those completely different settings. It takes so long. That process is very long. And I think most people want to rush it so fast. Process is so important, but people, and I think often policymakers, they want to know, what's it going to cost to implement it? How much is it going to save me? And when can I roll it out? And asking people to slow down and do a process that looks at the context and consults is so difficult. So yeah, I'm not adding anything. I'm just reflecting.
No. I think it's really interesting. One thing that I was struck by, and I don't know if this is just kind of the particular way that the British government British civil services is set up, is that often it was kind of presented to me that it was politicians. So I was a civil servant rather than the political side, but often it was the politicians who wanted to do stuff really, really quickly, have a big announcement, rolls. I must admit, actually, that my experience is it was much more commonly the bureaucrats who wanted to do that, who desired that kind of quite neat, let's do something big, quick, at scale, efficient. And that often kind of the politicians, when you spoke them through this about the importance of the process, about the importance of it being relevant to communities, were totally up for it. And my own kind of pet theory on this was that, well, certainly kind of in Britain, our elected representatives spend a lot more time with probably a lot more diversity of people than a lot of our civil servants or government officials. And actually kind of were more inclined to that way of thinking than a lot of people who were kind of professional government officials. So my own experience was actually, sometimes this was, we often said it was because of what ministers wanted to do, what the politicians wanted to do. But actually that wasn't, if you really kind of pursue that through, was that really the case? Or was it about kind of the incentives, the structures, that we had ourselves as officials, and then therefore, what interesting work did you need to do to unpick some of that to change it?
Yeah.
I know I'm conscious of the time, but I wanted to give David an opportunity to ask his question, if that's all right.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you, Kieron, for a stimulating presentation, and everyone for a fascinating conversation. Kieron, I was thinking about your second question and wondering what strategies you found effective for balancing clarity and complexity, and whether there are any examples from your own experience where you found that balance struck particularly productively, and if so, what the keys to that were. And
David, could you just share a little bit about who you are?
Yes, I'm a co-founder of DebateGraph, and so work mapping complexity with governments around the world.
Fantastic, David. I think your answer is going to be much much better than mine. Hey, I'll be honest with you. I don't have too many great examples of this. I think where I felt that my work, or I've seen others' work being successful, has kind of, the clarity at least has been around clarity of purpose, of mission, that everybody's kind of broadly after the same thing. My own experience is that too often I've seen clarity become simplification. You lose the complexity, you lose the sense that some of the stuff interacts. So for example, I gave kind of a map that we ourselves have drawn on our work around how you might intervene around childhood obesity in different environments. The big critical challenge that we give to ourselves here is that dynamic enough? Do we really understand politically, economically, socially, what might be happening in the world around that influences this? So I don't really I think you'll probably have a better answer than me, and I'd be interested in your views. But I've found that that too readily clarity becomes oversimplification, and then that's not really going to get us much further than we are. Obviously, clarity is important because the other risk is kind of over complexity, where, as I said before, people just kind of feel pushed to inaction because, like, crumbs, where do you start with all of this? So it does feel that there's kind of a bit of a knife edge to find on this. But where I have seen clarity, or where particular people have been on that knife edge, has been around kind of the consistency of purpose. So perhaps just back to kind of the mental health example I gave, kind of consistency of purpose around saying, on mental health, that was about saying, well, like 1 in 4 people have a mental health issue at some point in their lives. Consistency of purpose here is that let's not stigmatize this. This is very normal. This is part of being around. So being human. So let's not stigmatize that. So that I guess that kind of found some clarity to cut through, although it wasn't itself. It needed kind of further organisation beneath it to be both clarity and a sort of kind of coordinated set of activities that led to something. Because how about yourself, David? Have you seen anything brilliant that you would suggest to us on this call?
I think the character of your answer probably reflects a lot of the experience as well. I think there are clarities that emerge around process. So clarity of trying to keep the thinking provisional and iterative and open in the way, and holistic in the way that you've been describing. Clarity is probably also in terms of the qualities of the relationships, and that's been a big theme in the conversation. I think that rather like mediation, you're bringing people into a space where they develop a greater appreciation of the importance of the other participants in the process, and of the nuances of the relationships. And I think that can be productive, and perhaps also with that there's a sense of multiple clarities rather than a single clarity. That you can perhaps work to try and find clarity for each stakeholder within this space, while trying to keep some sense of the way that those clarities are interrelated. But it's a constant tension, because as soon as you start to tug at the complexity, you end up with a very rich hairball very quickly, and that can become overwhelming. And I guess part of the process is also just trying to hold that sense of overwhelm and disorientation long enough to get through to that clarity of purpose that you were describing, and the clarities of process and relationships as well.
Hey, what fascinating insight, David. Perhaps that's a really interesting note for us to finish on. How do you affect systems level change on complex issues? Perhaps that's our role as kind of those working on in public service or working on public benefit, is to be able to hold the space for complexity, not to be overwhelmed by it, but to be able to hold the space for it, confident that if we're doing these sorts of things around bringing people together, about being sufficiently user-focused, about being sufficiently iterative in our thinking, this will drive us to something that is more likely to work than not work. Because I guess kind of the broad history on a lot of these complex issues is that we're not making progress. And kind of definition of insanity is like carry on trying the same thing over and over again. So if that's not working, or maybe we have to work in a different way on some of these issues. And I like your description of it, David, of holding that space.
Yeah, I think that's a terrific note to end on. And Kieron, and thank you for leading the discussion, and everyone else, thank you for joining from Canada to South Africa to everywhere in between. We really appreciate the time that you spent, and are delighted to have you on Apolitical.
Brilliant, thank you all. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you, it was great.
Thanks, everyone.
Very much. Great, bye.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kieron. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Sean. It was really enjoyable, and real insights from everybody. So thank you for setting this one up.
Yeah, of course. And I'll send you a follow-up note afterwards. But any feedback or thoughts you have about how we can build these for the future and make them as useful as possible, we'd really appreciate it.
Of course, I'll be delighted to. Brill. All right. Thanks very much.
Thank you. And yeah, talk soon.
Talk soon. Cheers. Bye.